Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Industry Analyst Briefing hosted by Tech Data. My name is Phil Clark. I'm an independent analyst helping Tech Data really interpret what's going on in the Microsoft channel and just talk through some of the major implications that will have to the broader channel of Tech Data's customers. This briefing is going to be about 20 to 25 minutes long and it really covers the period from sort of April through to August 2022, looking at some of the major announcements that Microsoft have made and try and give a little bit of guidance of what's going on in the channel overall. As explained, my name is Phil Clark. I work for a company called Embedded IT. We're a very small set of consultants who specialise in looking at what's going on in the tech industry and providing guidance to both end customers in terms of buying strategies, but also the channel and distribution to support what's going on with specific vendors. And in this context, we've been working with Tech Data to look at Microsoft overall and just try and keep a view on what's going on with the headlines. Main objective is to give a sense of what's going on in corporate strategy, so any mergers and acquisitions and financial results, but also cover off the really high level key product announcements, only the key product announcements, not the detail of those, and any changes in incentives or channel promotions that would be useful to know from a customer perspective. And then we give a bit of context as to what's going on to the broader industry. My role, I'm independent, as I mentioned. This is not a sales pitch. I don't work for Microsoft. I don't work for Tech Data. Really, I'm here just to look at what's going on in the news and try and put it into a position across the broader industry to see how Microsoft are faring in the grand scheme of things. We're going to give you the headlines only. We're not going to get into the depth of any individual item, but we are going to give this presentation to anyone who requests it. And within the presentation, you've got links that will take you through to the various news items that hopefully will give you a bit more context to what we're saying. So moving swiftly on. In these assessments, we generally look at what's going on with share price performance, and that's really just to try and paint Microsoft's picture in the context of the broader industry. And you can see from this rather busy chart, there's a lot been going on in terms of share price volatility, but we've really tried to do a comparison between Microsoft's performance and some of its key peers. So in this chart, just to explain what it is, Microsoft are the black line, Apple are the blue line, Amazon are the purple line, and Google is the green line. And then the Nasdaq, which is the index of all the IT companies in the States, that's the orange line. And you'll see at the end result is fundamentally, between the period of mid-April and mid-August, the Nasdaq has outperformed all of the other major tech companies as charted here, with Microsoft around about 2%, the Nasdaq growing by about 10% over the period, but some of the other Microsoft's competitors really not faring quite so well. And there's probably a whole raft of reasons for this. Microsoft fundamentally are doing well because they are positioned in the cloud space, and we'll talk a little bit in a moment about their financial results. Amazon and Google are being impacted by their broader businesses. Amazon clearly is part of a broader retail empire, and Google is part of a broader the Alphabet empire, but to do with the media, etc. And some of the non-Google related businesses are not faring quite so well. And so the overarching share price is being impacted by that. And I think Microsoft are lucky in that their performance is very much hinged entirely on Microsoft-owned services rather than the performance of a broader online store, etc. Clearly you can see by the chart, things are tracking generally together. When the index rises, the broader individual stock prices rise. And I think this is actually mostly an indication of what's going on in the broader world. There's a lot of macroeconomic factors, as most people will be aware, the Ukraine war, cost of living increases and energy prices, and those sorts of things are starting to really drive a lot of volatility in the markets overall. And so the fact that anyone's growing in that context is pretty impressive, and Microsoft are a fairly consistent stock around that context. Some specific considerations are interest rate rises. Obviously, a lot of these companies are fairly highly leveraged, and so impact on interest is going to be a factor to most businesses. Now, Microsoft specifically have got a fairly healthy cash pot that they use for acquisitions, etc., something in the region of $60–70 billion. So there's no major issues from Microsoft's stability perspective, and they are fairly well protected with regards to the interest rate rises and those sorts of things. And the other factor that's probably directly relevant to Microsoft is energy prices. Now, most of you will be aware that Microsoft's strategy is very much around sustainability, and a lot of their data centers that power Azure are based on renewable energies. And so the impact of the energy prices in terms of fossil fuels doesn't really affect them quite as badly as some of the other data center providers who don't have the same strategy. So it's been quite a clever strategy for Microsoft overall to try and sit down and work out how they can move to a sustainable planet, not just for the environmental purposes, but also as an economic move. It's probably saving them a fair bit of money as the energy prices based on fossil fuels accelerate and become rather expensive. But you'll see overall there's quite a lot going on, but the general trend is upwards, and certainly since the end of July things have been going up fairly steadily at all levels with regards to the Nasdaq and all of the individual stock levels. And I think again that's all just factors to do with macroeconomics and what's going on in the general markets. Now you notice on this chart we've identified where Microsoft announced their third quarter and fourth quarter results, and you'll see the impact on the black line at that sort of date. Nothing really major. There was no major sort of spike or decline in the stock price, which is a fair indication that Microsoft are performing in line with people's expectations. And specifically in terms of their financial results, towards the end of July they announced their full year results. And as ever, incredible performance. They've just announced a full year revenue of just shy of $200 billion, posting about an 18% year-on-year growth, which in the context of all the other economic headwinds is very, very impressive. From a quarterly perspective, there's a lot going on. They're growing quarter on quarter, and it's consistent through the year, so it's not down to individual events. And certainly Microsoft's cloud strategy is starting to pay off because the annuity revenue growth is really supporting the overall business performance. You'll notice some specific things we've highlighted here. The backlog, if you look at the two highest red circles, at the end of calendar year 2021, sorry, financial year 2021, they had about 141 billion of contract obligation, which is effectively bookings, future bookings. That's gone up to 189 billion. So it's just a real indication of the strength of their order book going forward from a revenue perspective, which gives them a fair indication that they're going to be fine for the next 12 months or so. The other thing to bear in mind is that from an annuity perspective, they're operating around about 96%. So they're well protected with regards to spikes, and they're going to end up in a great place just sustaining growth. The interesting thing is that actually better underpins what's going on with their finances overall. If they're operating at around about 96% annuity and growing at 18% year on year, there's a real strength in that annuity growth, which is clearly sustainable and sets a really good precedent going forward. Within their metrics or their financial disclosures, that there was quite a lot of discussion around constant currency. They have been adversely affected by exchange rates, not to such an extent that there's any issue with financial stability, but I think the whole market is being very much driven by different exchange rates and fluctuations based on what's going on with the economies around the world. So Microsoft, being a global entity, does have some exposure to that. And actually, if there was a lesser exposure of the exchange rate mechanisms, then their 18% year-on-year growth figure would be slightly higher. So that's impressive in its own right. Now, I've mentioned the annuity figures. It's pretty clear from looking at the next level of detail down on their financial performance that actually the fundamentals of their business is now very much based around Azure. And Azure grew year on year somewhere between 45 and 49% in constant currency terms. So Azure's going gangbusters. There's a whole lot of growth going on around Azure, and it's clearly becoming the absolutely critical part of Microsoft's portfolio. Office 365 continues to be strong, but it's not quite as growing as steadily as it was over the last 3-4 years. And I think that's probably an indication of COVID, which drove a lot of adoption of the cloud, and especially at the consumer level. But also I think Azure is becoming the focus, and the portfolio of the Azure products is expanding at such a rate that there's a lot more to play with in Azure, and therefore revenue growth is a lot easier to come by. The downsides of some of the Microsoft portfolio in terms of financials is really all around individual products, mainly around PC shipments. Surface is still quite a prominent part of the portfolio. In fact, it posted something in the region of 15% growth year over year, but it's probably not as healthy a business as the likes of Azure. And certainly things like Xbox and the broader personal computing lines are in decline or flat year over year. So there's a lot of work to be done to balance out the portfolio. And if anything, I think the fact that Microsoft are very much focused on the Azure portfolio now will continue to be the case going forward. And you'll notice in the rest of this chart, it lists some of the things where decreases in growth are coming on. I think, other than Azure, It's still impressive that these products are growing in financial performance terms, but clearly there isn't going to be the growth that we've had over the last few years as people face the economic headwinds we've discussed previously. So all round, great financial results, very impressive overall growth, and Microsoft continues to be a very good business to work with. But I think the focus is very much on the Azure platform rather than the broader portfolio. In terms of other sort of corporate news announcements, there's been a number of conferences which some of you may have attended, and some really interesting things that came out of that. I think Envision, picking on one specific conference, there's a lot of content relating to augmented reality, sustainability. There's some key themes that Microsoft are trying to push, and with regards to augmented reality, there's a lot of focus on that, I think, because they're feeling that the Meta brand has stolen the brand head start for things like the metaverse, and Facebook have done a really good job of launching some of their products to get people to adopt the metaverse through the Oculus brands, etc. So Microsoft are keen to not lose track of where that initiative is going, and in Envision terms, some of the content was very much focused around what you can do with augmented reality and how Microsoft's product portfolio best supports that. And in fact, I can imagine there'll be some acquisitions over the coming months that will relate to some of those metaverse investments, and actually probably some clever re-moulding of some of the existing portfolio to bring it into a metaverse related product set. Other specific news items, there's a lot of fanfare around Microsoft Auto Patch, which streamlines the ability to roll out patching to various Windows platforms. So that has gone live now and is available on E3 and E5 licenses for Windows. There was a really interesting announcement around an integration between Microsoft and Oracle, where Microsoft and Oracle working together will allow you to deploy Oracle databases within Microsoft Azure and integrate back to Oracle's cloud infrastructure, the OCI platforms, as a native integration from Azure. So if you're an Oracle reseller and a Microsoft reseller, there's some interesting tie-ups there that maybe is worth investigating, because fundamentally it looks like there's some integrations that didn't exist previously between Azure and OCI. Teams has had some new features around some of the language interpretation functions, and there's a fair bit of press around how Microsoft's doing with regards to comparison for AWS or comparison to Google and what the different growth stats are. And we'll cover a little bit of this later on. One specific point, which is halfway down this slide, is a press announcement around Microsoft versus Google. How did the vendors giants fare in their latest cloud results? And it does a slightly unfair comparison of trying to show that Google's growth figures were better than Microsoft's, and something in the region of Google year-on-year growth for the GCP, Google Cloud Platform, was about just over 40%, and Microsoft was just over about 20-25%, but on a significantly bigger base. And I think it's really important to remember that Microsoft's cloud platform is something in the region of 4 times the size of Google, so achieving big percentage growth figures is a lot easier when you're coming from a small base. And so I think it's important to make sure that when we're reading some of these press announcements, they're treated with appropriate analysis rather than just the headlines. And similarly, you'll see some press around redmanrag.com, which is clearly a Microsoft related PR exercise, showing Azure usage surpassing AWS. Now that is a slightly misleading title. Azure is no longer, or Azure is not the market leader at all, and hasn't gone past AWS with regards to market share. What they're trying to say is Azure, the growth of Microsoft Azure usage is starting to gain on AWS, and as a percentage terms, Microsoft is definitely starting to gain some ground against AWS's market dominance, which we'll discuss later on. Outside of those announcements, they made a small acquisition of a company called Miburo that is in relation to cybersecurity, and the real purpose of that acquisition was to try and get better integration into non-English speaking threats. So there's a specialism that Miburo have around trying to offer cybersecurity across a whole raft of languages rather than just being focused on English. So that was quite an interesting cybersecurity related acquisition. And also Microsoft announced their Partner of the Year awards. This was back in July, and there were 6 companies that did very well out of the UK, which are listed on this chart. So congratulations to all those guys. And it continues to be a very prestigious thing to win Microsoft Partner of the Year. So like I say, a big result for the companies listed there. And then final point I noticed, which wasn't a big piece of corporate news, but I thought it'd be interesting from a channel perspective. They've launched a free one-on-one consultation for small business out of the Regent Street store. And whereas that isn't really big news because Apple have been doing it for ages in their Genius Bar, What this is starting to think is we could potentially interpret this as Microsoft trying to understand how they're going to engage customers direct rather than through the channel. Now, this might be a big blow up of something that's not actually a news item, but from my perspective, it seems a bit odd that Microsoft are trialling direct consultation to their end clients when they've got a partner base of about 30,000 companies in the UK that could do this very well for them. And I didn't really understand why they would be launching a whole new retail experience for end customers when actually they tend to rely on their channel for these sorts of services. So I think it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, and just one to keep an eye on to make sure that Microsoft's engagement with the channel is appropriate. A little bit about cloud market share, which we touched on a few minutes ago. Back in sort of June, July time, the Register did a really interesting piece of analysis looking at market share of the main cloud companies. And you can see the chart on the right hand side here showing the cloud infrastructure markets and the relative performance or the relative market share of each of those companies. And you'll see sort of step number one is the top three companies, Amazon, Microsoft and Google, have got around about 65% of the market overall. And that's good and bad in a whole raft of ways. Clearly, from a branding perspective, there's a lot of consolidation of those top three companies. From a competition's perspective, it does potentially cause a sort of monopolistic type environment, but fundamentally the three main companies are doing very well, and those three companies are growing at around about 34% year on year. So if you're Microsoft, Google or Amazon, you're doing really well in a growing cloud market. It's all going very well. The other interesting stat that came out of this piece of analysis is if you're not in the top three, you're not growing as well at all. So the other companies, the next 10 companies and all of the others together are growing at less than 10%, which just goes to further exacerbate some of the potential risks of having a consolidated market into three main companies, especially companies of the size of Amazon, Microsoft and Google. So there's some interesting dynamics going on in the cloud market, which I think probably needs a little bit of assessment. And if you're a buyer, it's clearly a concern. You've probably got three choices and you don't really consider the others. It's very difficult to start creating a proper competitive marketplace while those sorts of figures are in place. And you'll see in the chart at the bottom, which might be a little bit difficult to look at, it shows the relative growth or the relative change of market share for each of the main providers across a period of time since 2017. And the blue line is Amazon, the pink line is Microsoft, the light blue line is Google, and then some of the lower lines are Alibaba and Kyndryl. And you'll see, if you look closely, the others line and the Kyndryl line are pretty much in decline. So a lot of the other cloud providers are not growing as quickly or losing market share to the likes of Amazon, Microsoft and Google. And from this analysis, if you follow the trajectory of the pink line, which is Microsoft, it does look like they're gaining market share on Amazon. So there is an interesting dynamic going on over the next few years. Microsoft are looking like they are catching Amazon up, but Amazon are clearly market leader and continue to be so. And there will be obviously a lot of competition between those over the next sort of 5 to 10 years to launch new products to make it interesting to the market. The other sort of macro news going on in the cloud market is there's a lot of noise in the EU about anti-competition. There was some press probably 3-4 months ago where some of the smaller cloud providers are taking Microsoft to court around anti-competition, and this is really all about integrations between Microsoft's various products and their cloud platforms and stopping other people competing on a Microsoft basis. And so Microsoft have announced a set of European cloud principles, which are 6 main principles, all very, very straightforward, all very sensible. But the intention is to try and get Microsoft's platforms or Microsoft products more readily accessible by other cloud providers. And this is really, as an example, allowing things like Microsoft 365 and Windows to be deployable on somebody else's VDI infrastructure. So Microsoft have responded to some of the press that's going on and the legal action that's going on in the EU about anti-competition, but a lot of the sort of market share charts don't really help with some of those messages. So they're in an interesting place in the EU, and they might be on a broader basis to try and get into a position where anti-competition laws might restrict some of their product announcements or some of their growth going forward. And by contrast, Microsoft have tried to raise with the US government the dominance of AWS. So there is a lot of jostling for position going on in the cloud market to try and make sure that no one's going to get such a significant dominance that the market becomes uncompetitive. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on around cloud, which is definitely one to watch if you're in the cloud space. High-level key product announcements. These have all been announced in the last few months. Nothing really worth focusing on in any depth. There's some amendments to Azure Firewall Manager, which integrates web application firewall and DDoS functionality. Interesting if you're in the world of security. There's been some expansion of the intelligent data platform, which is really all about data governance and data integration. So there's some changes in that. So again, if you're in that space, worth looking at. Interesting bit of sort of collaboration news. Meta have decided they're going to use Azure as their strategic cloud provider. So Facebook will be running on Azure at some stage in the future, and they're trying to use that to leverage some of Microsoft's AI potential and some of the PyTorch collaborations as well. So clearly Meta see Microsoft as a credible third party to work with to support their data analysis and artificial intelligence aspirations. In the devices space, not much going on there. There's a new laptop go-to, a couple of other smaller announcements. So again, if you're in the world of devices, worth having a look at, but it's not really major news in the context of the broader Microsoft portfolio. Microsoft 365, the Microsoft Viva portfolio is quite interesting. They are trying to drive analysis and integration of multiple cloud platforms to give end user outcomes. So Viva Goals is really more about employee experience. Viva Sales is all about integrating CRM, 365 and Teams to allow customer facing salespeople to automate some of their tasks. And so the Viva platform is a really good idea because it looks at multiple data sources and tries to offer up interesting analysis associated with what's going on in your Microsoft portfolio. And from a sales perspective, that actually gives your customers a slightly different view of Microsoft because it actually shows the products working together in an intelligent way rather than what historically would have been siloed different product sets. And then there's also a couple of small amendments to Microsoft Defender, really just enhancing online security for Microsoft 365, very much focused at the consumer end. So Defender, which is pretty much de facto on quite a lot of people's desktops, is a well-established product and continues to be expanded. And the final point on the Windows thing, and it's really more to do with personal computing, and I drew it out because I'm a bit of a geek and I really enjoy Flight Simulator, and about 6 weeks ago, as part of the launch of the new Top Gun movie, Flight Simulator got an upgrade which had an expansion to include some of the planes from the Top Gun series. Now, if you're not so much of a geek, that might not be interesting to you, but fundamentally it's a really interesting tie-up because it just shows how keen vendors are generally in working with media to integrate adverts and product placement, if you like, into some of the virtual world. And I think this could be an indication of the way the metaverse will be going. Just seeing how the real world blends into virtual worlds such as Microsoft Flight Simulator and offer up all the various product support aspects as part of that. Couple of specifics. There's a big push around what's known as Gdap, or the granular delegated admin privileges. Now this is quite a specific technical point, but it's worth knowing because it does have a fairly fundamental change to some of the security aspects of a CSP partner managing multiple clients. Historically, the delegated admin privileges function, DAP, allowed you to establish role-based access for one of your members of staff, and they would have access to providing all of your customers' data based on that role. And so if you said someone was an admin for all of your customers, they would have admin access to all of those customers' data, which is sensible. The granular delegated admin privilege, it actually gives you the ability to narrow down not just role but also customer. So you can have an admin that's got access to customer 1 but not customer 2, and that clearly improves security overall and gets you to a position where you as an MSP and Tech Data and Microsoft have got better security and segregation between different customer workloads. Now this is becoming a mandatory requirement going forward. In fact, the delegated admin permissions are being phased out pretty much with immediate effect. So if you're an MSP or you're a CSP partner and you haven't embraced the Gdap initiatives, reach out to Tech Data and try and understand what it all means and get yourself to a position where you've followed the instructions required to support that and improve your customers' security aspects. And you'll see on this slide when we send it out, there's lots of links here which you can get to, which will give you a whole raft of resources and tools to help you go through the Gdap process and convert your tenants to best support Gdap. But as I say, I would encourage you to reach out to Tech Data and just see if there's anything they can do to help to make sure you're secured appropriately. A couple of other partner program changes. as most people are aware, the Microsoft Partner Network is evolving into the Microsoft Cloud Partner Program. Slightly more than a name change, there's some fairly big changes to the way partners are going to be assessed. The gold, silver competencies are going to go, and there'll be a whole raft of solution areas as listed here, which you will nominate yourself for. And then Microsoft will calculate a partner capability score, which will give you a sense, or give customers a sense of how credible you are in each of those solution areas. So it's quite a big change. It doesn't fundamentally mean a lot of work for you, but I think if you're a gold partner and proud of it, it's worth understanding how your partner capability score is going to be calculated, and make sure you're in a position that you understand how that'll happen go forwards. And certainly in terms of the details we've seen so far, those partner capability scores are going to be a combination of not just the amount of accreditations you've got, but also the number of net new customers you've added and the amount of seats you've got, so that there's a whole raft of metrics that you probably do need to start tracking to make sure you're in the right space for advertising your Microsoft capability. There were some price increases tabled for not-for-profit customers from the 1st of September, whereas that's always not necessarily great news, because increasing prices to charities isn't the best press you've ever had. There's some interesting dynamics around Microsoft's not-for-profit organisation, which actually is explained in the podcast I've set a link to here, which is Microsoft have a Tech for Social Impact initiative, and they've separated out not-for-profit revenues to go into a separate P&L, and all of the profits made in that product portfolio is reinvested into the Tech for Social Impact initiative to try and drive better adoption and better efficiencies in the not-for-profit sector. So although it's an increase in not-for-profit revenues overall, it does actually mean that it'll allow Microsoft to provide better services to a broader set of charities. So if you are in that space and you're offering those services to your customers, definitely worth understanding how that works, and by all means click on that podcast. It's an interview between myself and a guy called Ian Drew, who runs the Tech for Social Impact initiative in the UK, and he explains it beautifully about how that all works. And then final points, there were some changes in July which some of you will be aware of. The new customer experience, or NCE, has been a bit of a turbulent ride for the last year or so, and there were some changes in the announcements to auto renewals that were originally tabled to finish in July, but subsequently have been withdrawn. So you are able to continue renewing legacy agreements on the outside of the NCE portfolio, but it's probably not best practice to do so. So if you're still not fully embraced NCE, by all means get in touch with Tech Data and work out how you can get involved, because it's becoming very important. You will start losing out on rebates, and you might not be able to renew some of your customers if you haven't got your head around what NCE means. A little bit of industry context. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world, as most people are aware. From a sustainability perspective, the broader press are doing a lot of comparisons around the sustainability angles of the cloud providers, and you'll see here there's a couple of links to different press articles which do exactly that. The top one, comparing AWS and Azure sustainability, is a really interesting piece in computing, where there was a subjective review of how Azure compares to AWS from a sustainability perspective, and it showed actually how incredible Azure is by comparison to AWS. It was a desk-based research, nothing really tangible in terms of carbon footprints and stuff like that, but certainly highlighted some of the key differences between Microsoft and AWS from an approach perspective, and some of the accreditations and the general approach that Microsoft have got to renewable energy and reducing data center consumption, and things like their under the sea data centers and those sorts of initiatives where they're trying to find innovative ways of reducing their power consumption and cooling costs, get drawn out as part of that report. So if you're looking to explain to your customers why they should go Azure over another cloud platform based on sustainability, that's quite a useful resource to follow up for. In the metaverse, clearly a big thing. There's a lot of discussion at the moment going on around standards. The link here takes you to a press article which talks around different standards that are being adopted, and there's a consortium being built across all of the main players in metaverse, including Meta, but also some of the big retailers like IKEA, where they're trying to understand how best to map out the standards and the ethics associated with what could happen in the metaverse and what's good and bad. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out as the metaverse becomes a slightly bigger portfolio. Cloud, all the news about that is about growth. It's continuing to grow and will continue to grow for the foreseeable future. We've busted through some big numbers now in terms of revenues, and I think it's going to continue growing. The forecast is something in the region of $600 billion in 2023. So it's a big market that's growing enormously. Definitely worth getting involved if you're not already. And a couple of sort of emerging reports around what's going on with the change in the economic climate. Obviously, there's a lot of people nervous about the way the economy's going, and certainly Oracle are starting to lay people off. Microsoft are actually asking to try and cut costs, and I think you'll see a lot more of this in the industry overall as people are starting to reassess their costs and their balance sheets to prepare themselves for a recession or economic downturn over the next few years. Again, so from a channel perspective, worth understanding how you prepare yourself for that and make sure you're in a position where you can sustain any turbulent economic climate over the next few years. Little plug for some of the other work we're doing with Tech Data. For those of you who aren't aware, we actually do a Microsoft Channel Discussions podcast. For every couple of weeks or so, we interview key people from Microsoft or Tech Data or the channel and talk about different things that are going on in the Microsoft channel, very much like this, but more interview style. And so if there is something that you're interested in getting involved in, or you want to get involved in the podcast particularly, do get in touch with csp@techdata.co.uk and we'll give you all the details you need to try and get involved in interviewing. Over the next few months, we'll be definitely talking about things like security, talking a little bit more about the new cloud partner program, and there's some other things as well lined up. So if there's anything of interest that you want to hear about, please do get in touch with the email address on the chart. And that is the end of the industry analyst update for this quarter. Got any feedback, or if you've got any questions, please do get in touch with me. I'm phil.clark@embedded-it.co.uk, or via the Tech Data, which is the main contact point, which is csp@techdata.co.uk. We'll be doing another one of these in the back end of the year, sort of November time. So if you've got any feedback, please do get in touch and we'll try and roll it in. Thanks very much.